And we are back on the 0 hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest has written a new and I think important book on the struggle for Palestine. OMAR ZAHZAH is a writer, poet, organizer of Lebanese Palestinian descent. He is also assistant professor of Arab and Muslim diaspora studies at San Francisco State University, and his new book, published by the Censored Press and Seven Stories Press, is entitled Terms of Servitude: Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. So, first of all, Omar, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, if you don't mind just telling us in your own words why, well, the only words you have, I guess, what inspired this book? I know you'd been covering a lot of these related issues for publications like Middle East Eye and Electronic Intifada and so on. What led you to conclude that this would make a productive book?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I spent several years basically not just thinking about, but through my own experiences as an organizer, also experience like living with firsthand the implications of the internet and then what would become social media, and its broader implications for the Palestinian struggle. And so around 2021, your audience may recall that this was a period where we started to see increasing activism for Palestine from Palestinians on the ground, particularly in the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And they were basically protesting their looming expulsion from their homes by the Israeli government. And so what they did is they took to social media essentially to advocate for their cause. But, given that this was also following on the heels of the 2020 George Floyd uprisings, I feel that it happened to coincide with a broader moment at which media and I think global audiences at large were kind of primed for reconsiderations of issues pertaining to various forms of racism and oppression, and particularly primed for interventions that redirected kind of broader popular understandings of what constitutes racism from individual bigotry to kind of broader structural issues of dispossession. And so essentially, I saw these activists taking to social media and I saw it making a difference, even in terms of how they were increasingly platformed by corporate legacy media outlets to talk about their struggle, and the ways that journalists started reporting on Palestine and making part of the story the narrative interventions that these organizers and activists were bringing through their usage of social media in their activism. So I basically felt that I was experiencing this narrative shift, this broader cultural narrative shift on Palestine in real time. Again, this is 2021 going into 2022. But also, just as this is happening, I start to see the platforms that had made a lot of these narrative shifts possible become censors in their own rights. And so there was this phenomenon whereby the platforms and the spaces that had initially provided an outlet to counter some of the hegemonic messaging of corporate legacy media started to recreate that very silencing and recreate the erasure of Palestinian narratives, particularly through their what I would define as an anti-Palestinian content moderation policy. And we saw this increasingly playing out on meta platforms, Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, as it was known at the time, now X. And so, that got me to thinking, on the one hand, you've had these platforms, you've had these technologies that have made possible real gains in terms of broader messaging around Palestine and broader understandings of what the Palestinian struggle really is, shifting the rhetoric to really contending with the fact that we're talking about a settler colonial process. And yet, these same spaces that had made those shifts possible were now cracking down and trying to reverse the gains that they had inadvertently allowed to flourish on their platforms. And so it got me to thinking that, what we were seeing is really such a targeted form of digital repression of a entire collective group of people, as well as at times their supporters.
Mhm.
And I thought about, how we'd seen other interventions in terms of, criticisms of big tech, thinking about how these technologies that are billed as countering structural oppression are actually fortifying it. Studies like Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin, or, Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Noble. And I thought, well, it seems like we're experiencing something on a similar level for Palestinians, who in this case, are really being targeted and silenced and surveilled for their organizing and activism. And so I thought that it would be important to do a full length intervention that talked about the specific ways in which big tech targets and, suppresses Palestinians. And of course, because of the origins that I've just described to you, social media plays a large role in the text, although I do also get into other forms of oppression, including, the AI targeting systems used by the Israeli occupation forces, because you can't really talk about this topic without getting into the colonial military applications of big tech as well. But I did feel like because social media had done so much in terms of helping make some of these shifts possible, it was important to not take it for granted. And I think because we use these platforms so much, there's become, in some ways, unfortunately, such a part of our day-to-day lives, we can take them for granted. But I thought it was important to actually make an intervention that says this is a form of targeted suppression and censorship, and we need to accept it as such. And so that was the genesis of what led me to start thinking about doing a longer project that would become the book.
And one of the things that struck me in reading your book about this target, I mean, I ran afoul of the censorship aspect of it too. I'm not Palestinian, but and I think my experience is tangential. But for being on social media about the issue pre October 7th, 2023, I ran into some shadow banning and some other things, as many people did. But the difference, I think, and it comes out, you use the word erasure. And, I, as an individual who's not Palestinian, am not being erased. My identity, my people are not being erased in this process. But the other dimension of it, to me, that your book brings out is the fact that it is a sort of entrance into the digital realm of the whole uh, arena of propaganda that says the Palestinians don't even exist. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you kind of put it into sort of a comparative perspective because, again, I think it's so easy to kind of take for granted that social media has all of these strange and at times even impenetrable ways of running its platforms. And yet there are broader implications to what is normalized in terms of how Palestinians are treated. And part of it is precisely that we see how these digital platforms reaffirm the physical processes of expulsion, that the settler colonial project undertakes, right? And so again, when I use the term digital settler colonialism, as I do in the book, I'm really trying to get at how do digital technologies become weaponized in such a way as to reinforce physical processes of expulsion and ultimately, as we've been seeing, genocide as well, right? It starts with the erasure of the digital presence, which goes hand in hand with the cultural demonization and ultimately erasure of the indigenous presence of Palestinian people.
And if you layer that onto decades of mainstream media erasure of Palestinians, or when they do enter the mainstream narrative, they're prisoners versus hostages, or they're terrorists versus defense forces, or the many linguistic erasures that take place. If you layer this onto it, of course, it paves the way for the literal erasure that we've seen in the last couple of years. So I agree that I learned from that. Maybe if you could, just for a moment, about that phrase, digital settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is the phrase used to describe enterprises where people move from one part of the world to another and settle it and colonize it for their own use, and perhaps the use of their native countries, regions. but you distinguish a little bit, I think, if I recall correctly, between your use of that term and the way others have used it. And I'm a little curious to understand that a little better.
Yeah, that's correct. So I'm not the first person to use the term digital settler colonialism. And I'm very clear about that. But what I try to do in the text that I feel distinguishes my usage a little bit is that I want to use the term also to really emphasize how what we're seeing is a collaboration. And this is a collaboration between the anti-democratic US big tech industry and the Zionist settler colonial project. And so I felt it was really important not to elide the fact that you have these two forces willingly working together because I think some of the dangers of both the criticisms of Israeli policy on the one hand, and on the other hand, even other big tech criticisms that we see is sometimes there can be this inadvertent movement towards inevitability where people say, well, it's just a given that, these projects are going to end up working in the way that they do, right? But there's nothing predetermined about the fact that these companies are going to go all in and supporting a settler colonial project or a genocide, right? There's nothing that's forcing their hand in terms of, being as entrenched with the Israeli political project or the Israeli tech sector as they are, right? They're making an active choice to do that based on their bottom lines. And of course, based on the fact that supporting geo-imperial US politics has always been good for business, right?
Right.
But again, they're choosing to do this. And so I felt like I wanted to use it in such a way to remind everyone, including myself on a certain level, that this is a result of active collusion. There's nothing inevitable about this. And so it needs to be decried as collusion and it needs to be resisted as collusion.
And one of the things I was thinking about, and I don't mean to fixate on this, but I want to return to it for a second, Omar, is when we talk about erasure and setting the laying the groundwork for this kind of devastating form of settler colonialism through digital means. I think about when people talk about censorship, for example, that doesn't begin to cover it. Censorship, I think of, okay, I'm in a prison. My family gets a letter from me with big black blocks of text marked out, right? You know that a letter was sent and you know that there were things said. You also know that somebody sent the letter. This is censorship, right? But when the insidious nature of digital media at times when they do things like deprecating, so people don't see your work or is they don't even know you exist. And if you imply that to an entire people, and your book talks about not only activists, which is bad enough, but cultural groups and things like that, when you dedicate yourself to erasing all traces of a people on a medium that's supposed to include 100% of everything. That is part of, you refer to Gramsci and others in the use of the word hegemony. Tell us a little bit about that, because to me, those two thoughts are very connected, that it reinforces a way of thinking that is inseparable from acts of oppression. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, in the earlier parts of the text, I make clear that I'm of course relying on Gramsci, and in particular, I'm relying on Gramsci in the way that the Palestinian academic Edward Said had thought of the concept of hegemony to explain what he described as the discourse of Orientalism. So, these kind of othering ideas about people from the Arab and Muslim world, right? And so there's this phenomenon by which systems of thoughts and belief that are beneficial to the ruling class end up naturally becoming kind of recycled and redistributed within the cultural realm, the world of civil society, right? And so that process is usually how we refer to hegemony, to understand that redistribution of these ideas that are advantageous to power, kind of becoming culturally redistributed. So of course, corporate legacy media is a huge culprit in the manufacture of hegemony, or what we also come to refer to as manufacturing consent, right, for various political
Right.
projects. So, what I appreciate about your question, first of all, I'm just going to bracket this for a second and I'll come back to the second part, is that you're identifying precisely the distinction between censorship and erasure, right? Palestinians were never meant to even have their existence acknowledged, whether it's through corporate legacy media or other ensuing forms of media. And this is why, to go to another, essay by Said, the idea of permission to narrate becomes so important because
Mm.
the way that information is presented, the way that you think about a struggle, it's not just about literal bits of information. It's about how do you humanize the people involved in a particular political issue or a form of struggle, right? Are they given the space to speak about their experiences? Are they recognized as being, pretty much the same as the audience that's viewing? Or are they, as in the case of Palestinians, strategically removed from these spaces, while at the same time the other perspective, the Israeli perspective, is so platformed, you tend to see that as human. So, the part of the reason that the digital suppression is so insidious is it actually builds on these decades of media dehumanization that we've already seen to be in place. And so what Palestinians had done, in this brief interim period that I was talking about in the early 2020s is again to find another wedge to kind of pry their way through that space that they were never supposed to be able to access. And now, big tech is cracking down on that intervention as well. And so, all that's to say that, yes, precisely, it's beyond just censorship because this is related to an existence that we're never even supposed to acknowledge as an existence to begin with. It's an entire project of attempted epistemological annihilation, I would say. So the very fact that sometimes Palestinians are human, has still had to be its own kind of form of messaging before you can even get into the nuances of the political struggle because of the successes of those decades of dehumanization. So yeah, exactly. We're not just talking about censorship, where even as repressive as it is, you can at least understand the mechanisms of how it operates and think about, okay, how am I gonna, outwit that? This is about the fact that an entire people was never supposed to be recognized in the first place. And now that they've been able to successfully utilize platforms to challenge that, again, the powers that be are trying to reinforce that entire flattening and that invisibilization.
And people don't realize the extent to which your book covers it. Again, the book Terms of Servitude, which I believe is a play on terms of service at social media, right? Is that right?
That's right.
And you talk about this at length, is the highly organized nature of the social media attacks, trolling, and those sorts of things. This is not, somebody goes on and says something bad about Beyonce and all of Beyonce, and I don't mean to trivialize the subject with that comparison, but I'm making a comparison to something trivial, right? Nobody's trained. There aren't thousands of people trained to go online and attack you if you criticize Beyonce. They're just people upset. That's what people think social media is. The difference with what happens if you advocate for Palestine or just talk about Palestinian history and culture online, oftentimes is you're up against large numbers of, I think you call them at one point cyber super soldiers or something, but with scripts, with, they're not just saying what they think the way your neighbor might about the situation in the Middle East. They have scripts to refute. There's this whole school of Hasbara, as they call it in Israel, of the narrative that they're pushing and how to counter every argument, regardless of whether that argument is right or wrong, with debaters' tricks, basically. So the fact that social media is literally a battleground in that sense, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You're exactly as you pointed out, you're going to be dealing with all levels of antagonism if you try to engage the question of Palestine, right? And one of them, before I get into this, multi-operational level in terms of, the government and individual activists, is to get back to something you'd asked about in your previous question that I realized I forgot to address, is this question of shadow banning, right? So
Mm-hmm.
a platform can basically limit your reach so that a post doesn't get anywhere at all. And so I talked to activists, who had experienced this and talked about how they they were able to recognize it just because they have such large followings that they would see, okay, if my post is not being seen, and I have over maybe 70,000 or so, I forget the exact number, but it's something, astronomical to that extent. They're like, there's something going on. But most people can't even recognize it. And it's one of those forms of censorship that is especially tricky because companies don't even acknowledge that it exists. Usually they'll try to gaslight people and say, well, you must not be using the app right, or we don't do that. We don't know what's happening. There's always a bug or so. And to the extent that some scholars have referred to that as black box gaslighting. But, I bring up that example partly because, those same organizers are, individuals I talked to who had experienced these, coordinated campaigns of trolling as well, that this question was asking about. So there's so many levels of this, right? One of them is that with the increasing refinement of AI technologies, the Israeli state has been able to the Israeli state and its political allies as well, I will say, have managed to really successfully level up their ability to do AI bots, right? Because traditionally the idea is that you have individuals who have a script who go off of that
Right.
and they're taught to go to a post, and to maybe run through a standard number of talking points, right? But now with the refinement of AI, you can also have bots, or super bots as they're called, that also do the same thing. So you just have this multi-pronged barrage that people were experiencing, particularly during the first year of the genocide, where it was just, being swarmed by these bots, as well as, individual, Zionist or Israeli aligned figures and activists, right? And so there's the refinement of this technology. There's the Hasbara, or, fellowships, or the propaganda fellowships that pay individuals to advocate for Israel on their campuses. There's the increasing attention that the Israeli government itself is paying to social media in terms of putting millions of dollars or the equivalent of millions of dollars into training people to be, super soldiers, quote unquote, for Israel, as well as, Netanyahu, you've seen over the past few weeks, very directly admit that social media influencers are a part of, the Israeli narrative war to the point where he's saying
Right.
we need actual, high level influencers to be advocating, the Zionism and the Israeli project. So
And he's going on
you're,
these wacky podcasts where you'd
yeah,
never expect a head of state to, these basically goofy kids is what they
yeah,
seem like. And this is the latest front in the settler wars, I guess.
exactly, exactly. And maybe there's also a level of that. I thought it was so funny, but I don't think he's seriously doing this, but there's a level of that where I'm thinking, maybe he's trying to also kind of have himself be a figure who's seen as, influencer adjacent. Like if I'm in with some
Right.
of these,
With the young people, with
yeah.
it's that's a terrifying thought actually. But
Yeah.
the and speaking of technology and genuinely horrific thoughts, you also talk obviously about the weaponization of AI. And AI, if people don't realize it, it's driven off social media and large scale data processing too. So we're all fueling a lot of these technologies. Some are more specialized than others, but certainly large language model AI uses social media as one of its primary engines. I was actually horrified. I learned from your book. I knew about AI generated kill lists. I remember there was one that was named after the Hebrew word for gospel, I think it was.
That's right.
And then there was lavender, which you mentioned. There's actually one called "Where's Daddy" that helps the Israeli offensive forces track Palestinians targeted for assassinations to see when they're home. I mean, this is the name itself. I mean, what twisted mind could think of that, right?
Yeah. 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 You see the insidiousness. I mean, I mean, dehumanization and sadism doesn't even begin to cover it. But, even the very naming of some of these things, let alone their function, is a part of the the offensive against Palestinian humanity, right? That this can be the
Right.
subject of a joke, that this is something that can register as funny to all of us, to our military apparatus, and to our broader society, the majority of which is supporting these types of actions, right? So, yeah, there's the reprehensibility of what the actual AI targeting programs are doing, as well as the fact that, just, yeah, the naming of them, the levity with which they're treated and they're applied, the utter lack of humanity. I think it's astounding. And I mean, I think that there's just something to the Zionist project where it's just there's always something that's going to flabbergast you all over again. You think you've seen everything
Right.
and then you just see the next level.
And of course, part and parcel of that to me is the independent film that I forget who made it, but basically supercuts of Israeli soldiers' social media and other Zionist Israelis celebrating the slaughter in Gaza. And I think the ZDO, Mehdi Hassan's website is playing that film now, but the use of social media internally within Israel and within the Zionist culture to dehumanize is things like "Where's Daddy?" It's just replete with things as horrible and much more horrible, which is maybe a dimension of this social media war that surfaced after you wrote the book. I don't know, but it's dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, there is a chapter in the book where I go into this as well, and I talk about how you can just look at the disparate social media usages of the occupation forces on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can look at the Palestinian resistance or other resistance actors, where on the one hand, you're having this usage of social media to really delineate the increasing sophistication in terms of hitting military targets. On the other hand, you're having the video that's showing exactly what you described, where it's just celebrating this wanton destruction or these depictions of, these occupation forces soldiers having Palestinian captives or destroying their homes and, saying things like, I'm dedicating this to my daughter. Just these really, really sick acts, right? And so, part of what I was arguing in
Or
that
dressing
section,
up. I'm sorry to interrupt, Omar,
yeah,
but dressing up as Palestinian women and saying, "Oh, I can't feed my baby." I mean that's
yeah,
monstrous.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so, part of what I was getting at too is if you want to really see like how this is a colonial project, just look at those disparate uses of social media, right? And
Right.
I felt like I had a fair amount of examples. I certainly didn't have nearly the extent of it. And some of the people that I was citing in that chapter also talk about how this has been ongoing since the 2010s, probably earlier, but really with the increasing reliance on Facebook, it became just this sick tradition that, occupation forces soldiers would start to do things like that, documenting their time, you know, in the
Yeah.
military and having photos of Palestinian captives or the things that they're doing, that they are trying to pass off as a joke, right?
Yeah, and maybe I know a lot of occupation armies do it now, I've always done that kind of thing. I mean, but it's social media takes it to a new level of amplification. Omar, I wanted to talk about also the a different dimension of this. You mentioned the AI generated image, all eyes on Rafah. And I thought that was an interesting case study, a kind of slightly different dimension of this whole struggle. Tell us about that for a second, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah. So I talked about this AI image, All Eyes on Rafa, that had gone viral during a particular moment in the genocide, post October 7th. And, in that chapter, I was talking about several things. One was just kind of doing a recap of how this image, got to be particularly viral. Um, and, part of that was, the fact that it was boosted by so many celebrities, and
Mhm.
actors. But then I also got into and of course it reflects like this increasing, opposition to the genocide, right? So it's
Right.
kind of an important digital index of that. But Another aspect of it was that, I thought that this was such an interesting occurrence because it also converges with the increasing censorship of both posts by Palestinians as well as actual footage or documentation of what was happening in Gaza, right? Because part of what these social media companies now do is they try to censor this or at least partially censor by saying, oh, this is sensitive content or this, shows violence. Or sometimes I've heard of people having their content flagged as like, promoting violence or even terrorism when they're depicting something that happened to a Palestinian, right? They're not
Right.
actually like calling for violence, but they're showing something. So all of which is to say that part of the virality of that image really was made possible by the fact that Palestinian content in and of itself is so censored that you needed to have something that was AI generated, which is by design, at least in that point in time, really able to get by the different tiers of content moderation, because AI is naturally primed to not flag the types of things that human generated content can, right?
Right, right. And
So,
there's no action, as you point out, no Palestinians in it. So it's
right.
showing support for Palestinians within the convention of not acknowledging the existence of individual discrete Palestinian people. That's that to me, and I've seen other AI images like that, especially at one point, maybe a year ago or so, they were more common, but row upon row of people marching back and into Gaza, but and I guess I see what they're doing, but at the same time, no faces, no, just masses of people and so on. So, well, maybe we can, as our final theme, talk about this. You do talk about how people are reclaiming this territory, this disputed, to say the least, territory of the digital world. And of course, we've also seen, even in recent months, a dramatic shift in public opinion in the West toward Palestine. I don't know what role I don't know if that's despite social media or whatever, but talk a little bit, if you would, just to wrap us up about, how this space is being recontested.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also say that this is something that even people that I interviewed in the book had sort of different ideas about because, I talked to some organizers who said, we really just need to leave social media, because these are private companies. This is the equivalent of doing a protest on private property. Like, we're always going to be restricted. And then I had other people who would say, no, we need to meet people where they're at, and then for like the fact of the matter is most of our bases are still on these hegemonic platforms because they make themselves so hegemonic, right? That's part of it. So there were differing opinions on that, and I do think that it's very clear that social media itself is trying to continue on this trend of, becoming of standardizing, let's say, its anti-Palestinian policies, which you even see in things like the increasing number of quote unquote Zionist or anti-Zionist policies on platforms, like, when platforms do things like these are the conditions under which we will moderate posts about Zionism, right?
Right.
And of
Or
course,
equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
well, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah,
right.
absolutely.
So those things are increasing for sure, and I think that um, I don't see that, reversing at this point, but I do also think that what I take some hope from is honestly just that I think it's a little bit too late. Like, I do think the cat's out of the bag. I think people have seen, what the Israeli project really is through this genocide, and there's no reversing that. So even if a platform does become more censorious, I do think that there's still implications for individual Palestinians, again, particularly folks who are trying to get support for families or fundraisers or, trying to continue to get like that is, serious. And I don't think that should be underestimated. But just in terms of broader public and political sentiment, I don't think that the censorship is going to reverse that at this point. And I don't think there's any, video or type of content that Israel can suddenly come up with that's going to, undo the damage that it actually has willingly done, not just to Palestine and Palestinians, but to itself over the past 3 years. I think that's gone.
Oh,
So, you know,
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And my hope is that, as with similar efforts going on in the academic field and elsewhere, that these efforts are so heavy-handed and obvious at this point that they undermine the forces behind them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'll just end on one final note, which
Sure.
is, because the whole book is about repression. So I feel like it's always important to emphasize the positive takeaway of things. And I'll say that although by the time I finished the book, I was a lot more pessimistic about social media, I was much more optimistic about people. And I realized that it had always been the creativity of Palestinian resistance in repurposing, let's say, hegemonic media for purposes other than that for which it was intended to be used that has always made the difference. That's what made the difference, when the modern Palestinian liberation struggle was launched in the 60s. And that's what's been making the difference today from 2021 to past October 7th. And I think that's what's going to continue making the difference.
Well, thank you for ending us on a positive note. Again, my guest, Omar ZAHZAH, his new book is Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. Omar, thanks for all the good work in writing this book, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.